She stirred the pot like she had something to prove. The mess hall was quiet, just the low hum of the generator outside and the faint murmur of soldiers killing time between patrols. She stood at the stove, apron tied over her tan uniform, hair tucked under a net, and eyes elsewhere. Most didn't notice her much. Why would they? To them, she was just the cook, the woman who made sure the coffee was hot and the eggs didn't burn. Nothing tactical about that. But tonight felt different. The air outside the base fence was too still. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. "Hey, Morales," one of the Marines called out. "You burnin' the stew again." She smiled faintly, but her mind wasn't there. The radio chatter earlier had been odd. Something about a drone losing signal. Something about movement in the ridge line. She caught it only because the comms room was right next to the kitchen. She stirred again, slower this time, trying to quiet the feeling in her chest. That hum, that low, restless hum before something breaks. She felt it once before, years ago. Different country, different uniform, same silence. No one here knew who she really was. And that was fine. The night dragged. Soldiers drifted in, grabbed their meals, left. The mess hall emptied, lights dimmed, and the desert outside sank into a quiet darkness. Morale stayed back to clean. That's when she heard it, the pop of static on the outer perimeter radio, faint but sharp, followed by a pause that made her blood run cold. Then, one single shot. Not close, but not far either. She froze. Every sound after that was too loud, the hum of the fridge, the metallic clink of her ladle hitting the pot. She turned the burner off. Probably just a misfire, she whispered to herself. But she didn't believe it. She walked to the back storage, unhooked her apron, and stared at the small, locked cabinet no one ever touched. The one labeled supplies restricted. She had the key. Of course she did. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside wasn't food. It was a weapons crate. M4A1 carbine. 2 full mags. A suppressed Glock. And a knife she hadn't touched in 2 years. She exhaled slowly, feeling her heartbeat calm, not from peace, but from purpose. Outside, voices rose. Someone shouted near the north gate, followed by gunfire, short, controlled bursts, not panicked. The Marines on watch knew what they were doing, but the sound was wrong. There were too many shots. She loaded the rifle like muscle memory. Click, rack safety off. Her reflection in the stainless steel counter didn't look like a cook anymore. As she stepped out into the hall, Private Lewis nearly ran into her. "Ma'am, get back inside. We've got contact outside the wire." She grabbed his arm, voice steady. "How many?" "Don't know, maybe a dozen, maybe more. They're flanking the motor pool." She didn't wait for him to finish. Her boots hit the dirt. The night sky stretched black and endless above the desert outpost. Tracers cut through the air like red scars. The first explosion hit near the watchtower, throwing dust into her eyes. She moved low, fast, every step precise, not like a cook. 2 Marines were pinned behind a Humvee near the motor pool, firing toward the ridge. She slid in beside them. "What have we got?" she shouted. "Snipers, at least 2 on the ridge, 1 RPG hitting fuel tanks. Who the hell are you?" She didn't answer. She took the rifle, peered through the sight, and found one of the muzzle flashes up high on the rocks. Exhale. Wind. Distance. Trigger squeeze. The rifle cracked once. The flash disappeared. The Marine stared at her. "Holy, what the—" "Reload and cover left," she said, calm, almost gentle. She crawled to the next vehicle, scanned again. The other sniper shifted position, moving low. She fired once, missed, adjusted, fired again. Silence. The air filled with smoke and the smell of cordite. She hadn't felt this alive, or this haunted, in years. Inside the command post, Sergeant Miller was barking orders. "Get the lights off. Move medics to Sector 3, where's the quick reaction team? Morale stepped in through the haze of dust and adrenaline. He turned, half ready to yell, then stopped. What the hell are you doing here with that rifle? She didn't flinch. You've got 8 men holding a perimeter meant for 30. You need shooters. He blinked, recognition flickering. Wait, Morales, that's not your first name, is it? She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed a headset. Comms are dead on East Tower. I'll re-establish relay manually. Miller stared after her as she left. Who the hell is she? Halfway to the tower, she saw Lewis again, this time dragging a wounded corporal to cover. Morales dropped beside him, pressed a hand against the corporal's bleeding leg, and tied a tourniquet. You'll be fine, she said, voice low. Stay awake, all right. He nodded weakly. Thought you were the cook. She gave a small, tired smile. Yeah, I get that a lot. Then she stood just as an RPG screamed overhead and hit the storage shed behind them. The blast threw her forward, dust and sand biting her skin. Her ears rang. She pushed herself up, dazed, and saw movement through the smoke, silhouettes closing in. Enemy boots. She ducked behind a concrete barrier, heart pounding, counting their shadows. 4, maybe 5. One of them shouted in a language she hadn't heard since her last deployment, the one she swore she'd never talk about again. The words weren't random. They were coordinated, professional. Mercenaries. She swallowed hard. They're not insurgents, she whispered. Her hands steadied. Old instincts rose from somewhere deep, from years she'd buried under the smell of frying oil and coffee beans. She waited until the first silhouette stepped into view, then she fired. By the time reinforcements arrived from the south perimeter, the skirmish near the motor pool was over. 5 enemy bodies lay silent. One woman stood amid the wreckage, rifle slung, face streaked with dirt and ash. When Miller reached her, breathing hard, he looked at the scene, then at her. Where'd you learn to shoot like that? She wiped sweat from her temple. Long time ago. Military. She hesitated, something like that. He nodded slowly, still trying to process it. We've got wounded and comms down. We need someone on overwatch until sunrise. I'll take it. He didn't argue, not after what he'd just seen. Hours passed. The base quieted again, the kind of quiet that feels more like exhaustion than peace. Morales sat on the tower roof, rifle across her knees, watching the horizon shift from black to gray. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from memory. She promised herself she'd never hold a weapon again, not after the last mission, not after that night. But fate has a strange way of testing promises. She looked down at her hands, dirt under the nails, blood still on her sleeve, and exhaled. Below her, the base slowly came alive again, medics moving, soldiers whispering. None of them knew exactly what had happened. None of them knew that the quiet, polite woman who made their breakfast had once been part of something the Pentagon still pretended didn't exist. And she preferred it that way. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. Whoever sent those men, they hadn't come for supplies, they'd come for something else. And she might be the only one who knew what. When dawn finally broke over the desert, Morales stood on the watchtower, the sun painting her face gold and weary. She looked out toward the horizon, the place the enemy had come from, and felt that familiar ache again, the one between duty and peace. The cook's apron hung back in the kitchen, still waiting for her, but she wasn't ready to put it back on yet. For the first time in years, the soldier inside her had woken up. And she couldn't decide if that scared her or saved her. She whispered to no one in particular, maybe to the wind, maybe to herself. Sometimes you don't choose the fight remembers you. And as the sun climbed higher, the woman everyone thought was just the base cook kept her rifle close, eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for whatever would come next. Why was the intel officer asking about her file? By mid-morning, the base was still smoldering. Charred metal, sand crusted with soot, the faint hiss of fuel evaporating under the sun. Marines moved like ghosts, hollow-eyed, exhausted but alive. Morales sat alone near the shade of the generator hut, boots coated in ash, watching a medevac lift off in a swirl of dust. She slept maybe 20 minutes. Not that it mattered. Sleep never stayed long anymore. Across the yard, Sergeant Miller spoke in low tones with an intel officer from HQ, thin guy, clean uniform, the kind who'd never been near a firefight. He kept glancing toward her. Every time Miller said something back, quick, defensive. Morales knew what was coming before it came. The officer walked over, a folder under his arm. "Sergeant Morales, is it?" She kept her gaze steady. "Just Morales." He opened the folder. Elena Morales, born El Paso, enlisted 2010, honorably discharged 2018, Culinary Corps, but here's what doesn't add up. He held up a page, classified header redacted in black. "This portion of your service record is sealed. Why would a cook's file be sealed?" She didn't answer. He waited, pen tapping the folder. "You demonstrated unusual capability last night. Command wants to know how a base cook managed headshots at 200 meters in the dark." Her jaw tightened. "Maybe I got lucky." He smirked. "No one's that lucky." Behind him, Miller called out, "That's enough, Riley." The intel officer frowned but backed off. "Command, sending a team from Bagram. They'll want to debrief her." He looked at Morales once more. "Don't go anywhere." She let out a dry laugh. "Where would I go?" That afternoon, she helped move supplies from the damaged storage shed. Her sleeves were rolled up, sweat mixing with dust, every movement mechanical. The Marines around her worked in silence, some curious, some cautious. She could feel it, the way their glances lingered just a second too long. Lewis, the young private she'd helped the night before, finally broke the silence. "You really used to be in the teams." She glanced up. "What makes you think that?" He shrugged, awkward. "The way you shoot, the way you move. My cousin's a SEAL, says you can tell who's real by how they reload under pressure." Morales didn't smile. "Tell your cousin he's observant." Lewis grinned, but her tone told him not to push further. She looked at the horizon again, the ridgeline still blackened by smoke. The enemy had vanished before sunrise, leaving behind bodies and questions. Too organized for local militias. Too quiet for random raiders. Her gut said this wasn't over. That night she couldn't stay in her bunk. The heat clung to everything. So she sat on the steps of the mess hall, boots off, rifle across her knees. The moon hung over the desert, pale and cold. A figure approached Miller. He carried 2 mugs of coffee. "You look like you need it." She took one, nodded, "Thanks." For a while, neither spoke. Just the buzz of insects and the crackle of the perimeter lights. Finally, Miller said, "You saved a lot of people last night." Morales stared at her coffee. "Wasn't enough. Could have been worse." "Always could have been worse," she said softly. He hesitated, then asked, "You were one of them, weren't you, SEALs?" She didn't answer right away. The night breeze moved her hair across her face. "Once." "What happened?" She sighed. "Wrong mission, wrong time. Lost people I shouldn't have lost, so I left. Figured cooking was safer." Miller nodded slowly. "Safer until last night." Her eyes flicked toward the dark horizon. "Yeah, until last night." The next morning, the team from Bagram arrived. Black SUVs, tinted windows, sharp uniforms. They weren't standard Army intel, too polished, too cold. The lead agent introduced himself as Commander Bryce. Navy insignia, clean cut, unreadable. "Sergeant Morales," he said, extending a hand. "Or should I say petty officer?" She froze. He smiled thinly. "Don't worry, your secret's safe for now." He handed her a tablet. On it, drone footage replayed the previous night's assault, zoomed in, frame by frame. The attackers wore unmarked fatigues, no flags, no identifiers. "What do you see?" Bryce asked. Morales leaned closer. "Formation's too tight for locals. That's Western training. Look at the way the tail man pivots covering 6 o'clock. They're not amateurs." Bryce nodded. "We think they're contractors, ex-military, possibly working under a foreign flag." "Who hired them?" He hesitated. "That's what we need you for." Morales frowned. "I'm just a cook." He gave a faint, knowing smile. "Not anymore." For the next 2 days, the base turned into a fortress. Drones circled overhead. Patrols doubled. Morales found herself dragged back into a world she'd sworn off. She briefed guards on overwatch angles, calibrated optics, even walked Miller through tactical entry formations. Each time she picked up a weapon, something inside her stirred, familiar, dangerous, alive. But at night, when she was alone, she hated it. She left the Navy to escape the adrenaline, the ghosts, the constant calculus of life and death. But now, that part of her was awake again. She wrote in her old journal that night, "You can leave the war, but it doesn't leave you. It just waits for the next excuse to find you again." 3 nights later, it found her again. A power flicker hit the base around 200. Lights dimmed, then went black. The backup generator took 5 seconds too long to kick in. 5 seconds of silence. Morales felt it instantly, an instinct deeper than thought. She grabbed her rifle and bolted outside barefoot. A flare burst over the southern wall. Gunfire erupted, short, professional bursts. "Contact South Sector," someone shouted over the comms. Miller's voice barked orders, but the channel cut out in static. Morales sprinted through the dark toward the perimeter, the red flare painting her face in flashes. She reached the wall and saw them, 5 figures in tactical gear scaling the outer fence. Suppressors flashed dull orange. 2 Marines were already down. She dropped to one knee, fired 3 shots. 2 silhouettes crumpled. The third ducked behind the barrier. She moved left, low, flanking them. Her bare feet silent on the sand. She felt every heartbeat in her throat. The intruder popped up, fired. The round grazed her shoulder, hot, slicing pain, but she didn't stop. She dove forward, slammed into him, drove the rifle butt into his jaw. He fell hard. She finished it quickly, cleanly. But one word from his dying breath froze her. "Rook." That name. She hadn't heard it in years. She whispered it back like a curse. "How do you know that name?" No answer, just silence. She stared down at him. The tattoo on his forearm, a trident crossed by a dagger. Not foreign, not enemy. "Seal insignia." Her breath caught. No, that can't be right. By dawn, the attack was over. Only 3 intruders made it out alive, vanishing into the hills. Bryce arrived with his team again, stone-faced. They were using Navy-grade comms. "This wasn't random," he said. Morales stood near the body of the man she'd killed, his insignia still visible under the dust. He said a name before he died. "Rook." Bryce's eyes flickered. "You sure?" "Yes." He exchanged a glance with his aide. "Then it's worse than we thought." Miller stepped forward. "What's going on?" Bryce sighed. "Rook, not a name. It's a call sign. He's the leader of a rogue contractor cell, ex-special ops. Most of them vanished off-grid 3 years ago after a black mission went south." Morales felt her stomach twist. "Afghanistan, 2018. Bryce looked at her sharply. "You were there." She nodded slowly. "We lost a team that night. Half our men disappeared in a sandstorm. We thought they were dead." "Apparently not," Bryce said grimly. "They've resurfaced, and from what we can tell, they're after something in this base." That night, Morales sat in the dim mess hall again, lights low, her shoulder bandaged. She stared at the cooling coffee in front of her. She could hear echoes of old voices, her team, laughter in the dark before the storm, then screams, static, silence. Rook had been one of them. He'd saved her life once, and now he was hunting her. Lewis entered quietly. "You okay, ma'am?" She forced a smile. "I'll live." He hesitated. "You know these guys, don't you?" She looked at him, tired. "I knew who they used to be." "Then why are they doing this?" She took a long breath. "Because once you get lost in the war, sometimes you start fighting ghosts that aren't there anymore. Maybe they think I left them behind." Lewis frowned. "Did you?" She didn't answer. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the dunes. Morales stepped out, rifle slung over her good shoulder. She looked toward the dark ridge again, the same direction they'd come from, knowing deep down they'd come again. But this time, she wouldn't be running kitchen duty. This time she'd be ready. She whispered under her breath, a line she once heard her old co say before a mission went bad. "Forgiveness is earned, not given." And as the night swallowed the base once more, Elena Morales, the woman they all thought was just a cook, became what she had always been trained to be. A quiet storm waiting for dawn. Why did her old commander's voice echo in the enemy's radio feed? The following dawn was dust and silence. The sun crawled up slow over the ridgeline, throwing long shadows across the shattered base. Marines moved with that quiet urgency of people who knew it wasn't over. Morales stood near the southern fence, rifle slung, her shoulder bandaged tight beneath the tan fabric. She hadn't slept again. Every sound, the clank of tools, the whir of a drone, felt too sharp. Bryce and his intel team worked out of the comms trailer, running intercepted radio logs through encryption filters. She waited outside, packing. Every few seconds, her mind replayed the voice she'd heard last night, the faint, broken transmission in the enemy's chatter right before the firefight ended. She could swear it was him. Commander Harris. Her co from that black mission in 2018, the one who died, or so she thought. The trailer door opened. Bryce stepped out, a tablet in hand. "We confirmed partial voice match," he said quietly. 87% probability. Morales's throat went dry. "That's not possible." "I thought the same thing. But unless our data's corrupted, Harris is alive, and he's working with Rook." Her stomach turned. She looked toward the horizon, the desert haze shimmering in the heat. "Then this isn't about me," she said softly. "It's about finishing what we started." Bryce nodded. "Tell me everything you remember about that mission." They sat inside the trailer. The air smelled like dust and metal. Morales's hands trembled as she opened her old memories. "It was Helmand Province," she began. "Intel said a rogue scientist was trading bioweapon data to a local warlord. We were ordered to intercept and extract. Harris led the op. I was the Overwatch rooftop position, 700 meters north of target." She paused, the memory hurt. Halfway through the mission, comms went dark. Sandstorm hit harder than forecasted. We lost visual, lost GPS, lost everything. I remember hearing Harris yell something, then an explosion. Next thing I knew, I was being dragged out by Rook and two others. We barely made it back to the extraction zone. She took a breath, eyes distant. "We thought Harris was killed when the safe house blew, but if he's alive—" "Then he was never caught in the blast," Bryce said grimly. "He disappeared by choice." "Why?" Bryce hesitated. "We think he took something from that mission, something the government's been denying ever existed." Morales's eyes narrowed. "The sample." He looked at her sharply. "So you do remember?" She nodded. "Harris said it was top clearance, non-transferable. I never saw it, but I heard the scientist call it Vera." Bryce leaned forward. "Vera wasn't a weapon. It was a prototype data core, enhanced field intelligence. Self-learning, autonomous threat mapping, designed to predict insurgent tactics before they happened." Her voice went low. "And Harris stole it." He nodded. "And now it's gone dark for years until someone tried to access it again, from this base." Later that afternoon, Morale stood on the watchtower again, scanning the desert through her scope. The landscape looked calm, almost peaceful, but beneath it she could feel movement. If Harris had turned, if Rook was alive, then this wasn't just about vengeance. It was control. Whoever owned that AI core owned information warfare itself. She adjusted her scope, focusing on a flicker near the dunes. Nothing, maybe heat distortion, or maybe not. Behind her, Miller climbed up the ladder, carrying a radio. HQ wants updates every hour. Intel's got drones sweeping 20 miles out. Won't matter, Morale said. If Harris is running this, he knows our blind spots. Miller sighed. You sound like you know him. I do, she glanced toward the horizon. He taught me everything I know. That night, Morales sat in the dim mess hall again, writing in her journal under the flickering light. You never really bury ghosts. You just give them uniforms and call them missions. A soft knock broke her focus. It was Lewis holding a folded note. Ma'am, found this under the supply door. She frowned. From who? He shook his head. She unfolded the paper. 3 words. Ridge Midnight alone. Her pulse spiked. She stood, loaded her sidearm, and told Lewis, if I'm not back by 300, tell Miller to lock down. He froze. Ma'am. Just do it. The desert night was cold. The sand whispered under her boots. The ridge loomed dark against a silver moon. She moved like a shadow, low, silent, weapon drawn. When she reached the crest, she saw a figure standing by a burnt-out truck. Broad shoulders, combat vest, rifle slung behind. Rook. He turned slowly, hands open. Didn't think you'd come. Morales raised her gun. You sent men to kill me. Not to kill you, he said calmly, to warn you. She didn't lower the weapon. You murdered my people. I tried to save them. You think Harris died that night. He walked out with the core. You just never asked why. She hesitated. Then tell me. Rook stepped closer. His face was older, scarred, but his eyes were the same, the steady calm of a man who'd seen too much. Harris found out what Vera really was, he said. Not just predictive AI. It could simulate human behavior, create false intel that looked real. They used it to manipulate field data. Whole villages targeted off ghost signatures. We killed people who never existed. Morales's stomach twisted. That's not true. It is. Harris tried to expose it. They called him rogue, sent me to bring him in. I refused, so they erased us instead. The wind howled between them, carrying sand and silence. If that's true, she said slowly, why attack the base? Because someone reactivated Vera. We traced the signal here. Harris is trying to get it back before command buries it again. Morales shook her head. And you think I'll just believe you? Rook's expression softened. I don't care if you believe me. I just need you to choose a side when this goes down. You know Harris. You know what he's capable of. She lowered the gun an inch. And if I do? Rook stepped closer. Then by sunrise, everyone on that base dies. By the time she returned, the sky was turning pale. She slipped back through the gate quietly, avoiding the floodlights. Her mind spun. Everything Rook said could have been manipulation or truth. She went straight to Bryce's office. He was still awake, eyes bloodshot, data screens glowing around him. Rook contacted me, she said flatly. He stiffened. Where? The ridge. He says Harris is trying to retrieve Vera, says command lied about what it was. Bryce stared at her for a long moment. Then he said, he's right about one thing, command did lie. Morales blinked. What? Vera wasn't just predictive. It could rewrite real-time threat maps, manipulate satellite feeds, even generate false enemy intel. It was designed to control the narrative of war. She stepped back. You used it. He nodded grimly. Not me, the people above me. When the truth leaked, they buried it. They called Harris a traitor because he tried to expose it, but if he gets Vera now, he can prove everything. She whispered, "So he's not the enemy." Bryce's voice hardened. "He is if he takes that data public. You think they'll let him live. You think they'll let you live." That night, Morales lay awake in the barracks, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slow. Her world was unraveling. Harris was alive. Rook was alive. The government she once served had lied to them all. She turned to her side, hand resting on the pistol beside her cot. For years, she thought she'd escaped the battlefield by trading it for the kitchen. But now, she realized the war had never left her. It had just changed shape. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "I should have stayed gone." At 400, the alarms blared again. Not from the perimeter this time, but from inside the base. Morales was on her feet instantly. Red lights flashed across the hallway. She grabbed her rifle and sprinted toward the command post. Inside, chaos. Screens flickered, comms died, servers rebooted themselves. Bryce shouted over the noise, "It's Vieira, the system's been hijacked." Miller looked lost. "What does that mean?" Bryce slammed his fist on the console. "It means the AI's awake, and someone's controlling it from the desert." Morales felt her chest tighten. "Harris." Bryce nodded grimly. "He's found the uplink." Through the window, a distant glow pulsed from the ridge, like lightning in the sand. Morales turned to Bryce. "How long before he completes the transfer?" 10 minutes, maybe less." She grabbed her gear, slung the rifle, and headed for the door. Bryce called after her, "You can't go alone." She didn't stop. "I started this, I'll finish it." Miller caught up to her at the gate, eyes wide. "You're seriously going out there?" She nodded. "You've got a base full of wounded and a system that can't defend itself. Hold the line. Whatever happens, don't let anyone in." He stared at her, jaw tight. "You're not coming back, are you?" She gave a faint, tired smile. "Was I ever really here?" Then she stepped into the desert darkness, the wind swirling around her boots, the horizon glowing faintly with the light of a machine that was never meant to wake again. As she walked, she whispered under her breath, each word carried by the cold wind. "Sometimes the truth isn't a weapon, it's a wound that never heals." And with that, Elena Morales vanished into the sand, toward the ridge, toward her past, toward whatever waited for her at the heart of the storm. Why did she freeze just for a second when she heard her own name whispered over the radio? It wasn't fear. It wasn't hesitation. It was memory, something she had buried deep, rising again in the middle of chaos. "Cook, you copy," the voice repeated. She exhaled, "Copy." The base was barely holding. Smoke crawled across the sand. The air was thick with gunpowder and screams, hers and others. The attack had split the defenders into fragments, each group fighting from cover, trying to hold their ground. But this wasn't about survival anymore, not for her. It was about them, the team that had been ambushed outside the wire, the ones she couldn't reach, the ones who'd once treated her like a joke in uniform, calling her the kitchen girl. Now she was all they had left. She moved fast, low, weaving through destroyed vehicles and burning debris. Her rifle, taken from a fallen Marine, felt heavy, not because of its weight but because of what it meant. She wasn't trained for this, not officially. But she'd learned, piece by piece, from every man who ever rolled his eyes when she asked questions. She stayed late, practiced reloads when no one was watching, memorized radio codes and breaching sequences she wasn't supposed to know. And now, those lessons were all that stood between life and death. A burst of gunfire snapped through the sandbags ahead. She ducked behind a shattered truck, her heart hammering. 2 enemy fighters were advancing, silhouettes flickering through the smoke. She could hear their language, sharp, fast, coordinated. She waited, watched. Then 3 breaths later she fired. One fell. The other spun, startled, and hit the dirt. She didn't move, didn't celebrate, just reloaded and pressed forward. Her hands were trembling, but her eyes, those were steady. She reached the outer wall of the motor pool and knelt beside the comms panel. Static whispered through the headset. She twisted the dial, scanning channels, until she caught a faint transmission. Team Bravo pinned at checkpoint Delta. Repeat, pinned. The line cut off. She swallowed hard. That was them. The same men who once joked that her apron was her armor. And now she was the only one close enough to reach them. Her boots crunched on gravel as she slipped through a hole in the wire. The night air carried the smell of dust and cordite. Every few steps she froze, scanning shadows. She wasn't supposed to be here, she knew that, but supposed to didn't matter anymore. She found one of the fallen SEALs, barely breathing. His uniform was scorched, his radio smashed. He looked up at her, disbelief in his eyes. "You're the cook," he muttered. She pressed a hand to his shoulder. "Not tonight." Then she pulled him behind cover and bandaged his wound with trembling hands. Blood soaked her sleeve. When she stood again, her expression had changed. The fear was still there, but buried under something else. Resolve. She reached the outpost where the last firefight still burned. The sound of rifles echoed off the concrete walls. She could see flashes of muzzle fire cutting through the dark. Her pulse quickened. Her body wanted to shake, to hide, but her mind had already decided. She crawled to the side of the wall, peeked around, and spotted the enemy's flank. A small group, dug in behind a jeep, waiting to push forward. She steadied the rifle, inhaled. Then 3 shots. One after another, clean, controlled. When the last man dropped, she finally exhaled. "Bravo team, you're clear," she said softly into the radio. No response. She swallowed. Maybe they couldn't hear her. Maybe they were gone. She stepped over the debris and into the outpost and froze. They were there, 2 SEALs, both injured but alive. They looked up at her, disbelief etched across their dirt-streaked faces. "You," one managed to say. She didn't answer. She just knelt beside them, checked their vitals, and started patching wounds with a medic's precision she shouldn't have had. When the evacuation bird finally arrived, dawn had begun to break over the desert. The survivors were loaded first. The medics shouted coordinates, covering the noise of the rotors. And she stood there, covered in dirt, blood, and smoke, watching them go. One of the SEALs reached out a hand as they lifted off. "Come with us," he shouted over the wind. She shook her head. Not yet. Because there were still others unaccounted for. The chopper rose into the pale morning sky, and she turned back toward the smoldering base. Every step was heavier than the last, but something inside her had shifted. For the first time, she didn't feel like the cook they all ignored. For the first time, she didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Because she'd already done the one thing no one expected. She stayed. And sometimes, that's the hardest thing a soldier can do. That night when command finally called her name for debrief, she didn't go. She sat by the fire pit alone, staring at the horizon that still glowed faintly orange. She could hear laughter faintly from the med tent, relief, survival. And in that quiet, broken calm, she realized something profound. Bravery isn't loud. It doesn't need medals or witness. Sometimes it's just a quiet figure in the smoke, doing what must be done. And when morning finally came, she stood, wiped the dust from her face, and whispered to the rising sun. "Back to the kitchen, huh?" A small, tired smile broke across her lips. Not today. Why did she return to the ruins when everyone else was gone? The evacuation had already pulled out the wounded. The medics, the officers, even the pilots were gone. But she stayed. Because unfinished things don't let go that easily. The base was quiet now, too quiet. No gunfire, no engines, no orders echoing through the comms. Just wind, whispering through what was left of the walls. The sand had already begun to cover the tracks, erasing the violence as if the desert wanted to forget. She walked slowly between the wrecks. Her boots crunched on broken glass and shell casings. The air still smelled of smoke and oil. Every corner she passed carried ghosts of noise, men shouting, rounds cracking, steel tearing. She stopped where the mess hall used to be. The roof was gone, the tables burned. She stared at the twisted remains of what had been her world for months. Here, she used to cook breakfast for soldiers who never learned her name. Here, she used to hum under her breath when no one was around. Here, she had been invisible. And now, there was nothing left but silence. She sank to her knees beside the scorched counter and ran her fingers through the ash. Her reflection flickered in a shard of metal, her face darkened by soot, eyes red from smoke and sleeplessness. She didn't look like the person she used to be. She was. The radio on her vest crackled faintly. A voice, faint, distant, broken. Unknown unit. Anyone still on base? Request confirmation. She froze. That wasn't a voice from command. It was local, civilian. Repeat, the voice said. We have wounded. Northwest Ridge, please, anyone. Her heart kicked. There weren't supposed to be survivors out there. The ridge had been declared hostile territory, but she knew that place. She once delivered supplies along that trail. She lifted the radio. This is, she hesitated, then decided. This is Echo 2, I copy. A weak breath came through, relief. Thank God we've got 2 down, can't move. Hostiles in the valley, please hurry. She didn't hesitate. She just stood, slung the rifle across her back and started walking. The desert was brutal under the morning light. Every dune looked the same and every shadow could hide death. But she didn't stop. Her canteen was half empty, her knees ached, and her shoulder burned where shrapnel had grazed her earlier, but none of it mattered. Each step was a promise. Each breath a refusal to quit. By the time she reached the ridge, the sun was high. Heat shimmered over the rocks like liquid glass. She spotted movement ahead, a flicker of color among the sand. She crouched low, raised her rifle and moved forward. 2 civilians, local contractors. Their faces were pale, one of them bleeding badly from the leg. The other waved weakly when he saw her. You're from the base, he rasped. Was, she said softly, dropping beside him. She tore a strip from her sleeve and tied a tourniquet around the wound. The man hissed in pain but nodded in gratitude. You shouldn't have come alone, he said. She didn't answer, she just checked the horizon. The valley below was crawling with distant shapes, enemies searching. She counted at least 8, maybe more. The civilians couldn't walk, not fast anyway. She had 2 options, stay and risk being found, or create a diversion and draw them away. She stared at the rifle in her hands. The barrel glinted faintly in the light. Then she made her choice. Stay here, she whispered, no matter what you hear. She crawled down the ridge, using the rocks as cover. Her heart was beating hard, steady, almost painfully loud in her ears. The enemy voices grew clearer. Laughter, footsteps. She stopped behind a boulder, lined up her sights, and waited until they were close enough to see their faces. Then 3 shots, echoing through the valley. Shouts erupted. They scattered, firing blindly, searching for her position. She moved fast, firing again from a new angle. They thought they were chasing a squad. But it was just her. Minutes turned into an hour. The firefight dragged across the ridge until the last echo faded. The sand had turned red in places, the air sharp with smoke. She reloaded, breath shaking, vision swimming. Her radio buzzed again. The civilian's voice came through. They're gone, are you still there? She leaned back against the rock, exhausted. Still here, she whispered. She climbed back up to them. Both men were alive, scared, wide-eyed, but alive. When they saw her, one of them choked out, You're bleeding. She looked down, didn't even notice the streak of blood along her ribs. It's fine, she said quietly. Let's move. They made their way toward the old evac route, slow and silent. She helped them climb, pulling, pushing, guiding. The sun burned behind them like a furnace. When they reached the marker that once held a flag, they collapsed in the sand. "Rest," she said, "I'll get you water." She walked a few meters away, found a shattered canteen near a wreck. And that's when she saw it, half buried in the dirt. A dog tag. She wiped the sand off, squinting at the engraving. It was one of theirs, the seal who hadn't made it out. For a long moment she just stood there, holding it in her palm. The weight of it sank deep. Maybe that's why she stayed behind. Not for orders, not for duty, but because some things shouldn't be left behind in the dirt. She slipped the tag into her pocket, looked back toward the horizon, and whispered, "You're coming home." By dusk, a dust storm began to rise, orange and gold, swallowing the sun. She knew she wouldn't make it far in that, so she set up a signal flare near the ridge, hoping someone would see. Hours passed, the storm howled. The civilians huddled under a tarp and she sat outside, keeping watch. She thought about the days before the attack, the laughter in the kitchen, the smell of coffee in the morning, how she'd once felt small, invisible. And she realized she wasn't that person anymore. She stopped waiting for someone to see her worth. She'd become it. When the rescue chopper finally cut through the storm, its spotlight swept across the ridge. The civilians waved. She stood up, shielding her eyes, wind whipping her hair. As the crew lifted the wounded aboard, one of them reached down to her. "Let's go." She looked at the desert one last time, the base in ruins, the horizon empty. Then she nodded, "Let's go home." The helicopter rose, slicing through the storm clouds. She sat near the door, watching the sands fall away below. Her hand brushed against her pocket, the dog tag still there, warm against her skin. And for the first time in days, she let herself breathe. The voiceover would fade soft here, the music distant but hopeful. Because this was never about being a hero. It was about becoming whole again, in a world that tried to make her small. And as the chopper disappeared into the gold light, the narration would end with the quiet truth she'd earned. Sometimes courage isn't born in the fight. It's forged in the moments after. When the battle is over, and you still choose to stand. Why was she back in uniform after everything that happened? No one asked her to return. No one even expected it. But 3 weeks after the attack, she stood again in front of a new base's gate, her posture straight, her eyes unreadable, her bag light because she didn't carry much anymore. Only essentials, only what she could survive with. The desert wind still followed her. It always would. She signed the transfer papers quietly. The young corporal behind the desk glanced at her name, then looked up, confused. "Wait, you're the cook from Ridgepoint." She gave a single nod. He blinked. "I heard stories about what happened out there." She adjusted her pack. "Stories change," she said softly. "I just did my job." But he could tell her voice carried something else. Not pride, not shame, just a kind of tired truth that didn't need defending. Inside, the new base looked too clean, too quiet. Fresh paint, sharp uniforms, perfect routines. It made her uneasy. Every clang of metal reminded her of explosions. Every shouted order felt like a warning. Her mind still replayed that night, the screams, the silence that followed, the smell of burning sand. At night she couldn't sleep. The cot felt too soft, the air too still. So she walked the perimeter alone, boots crunching under floodlights, hand brushing the rifle strapped across her shoulder. Some nights she'd stop and just stare at the horizon, waiting for something to appear out of the dark, something that never came. But the memories did. They always came. A week later, she was back in the kitchen. Same white apron, same heat, same clatter of pans and chatter of soldiers. But something was different. She moved slower, quieter, watching everything, listening to every tone, every word. The soldiers still laughed, still argued about rations and shifts, but now when she passed they stopped. Not out of disrespect. Out of something else. Recognition. They knew her story now, or at least the pieces they'd heard. The cook who fought, the woman who stayed behind when everyone ran. Some whispered, others nodded silently. But none of them joked anymore. Later that month, an officer visited her kitchen. Commander Hale, decorated sharp, known for never wasting time. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "You're Elizabeth Monroe, right?" She nodded, wiping her hands. He studied her a moment, then dropped a folder on the counter. "You've been recommended for reassignment. Forward observation. Humanitarian escort, Northern Corridor." She blinked. "Sir, I'm not combat rated." "Apparently," he said, "that didn't stop you before." Their eyes met. There was no smile in his voice, but there was something close to respect. That night she sat alone in the mess hall, staring at the folder. It was thin, one-page orders, one map, simple on paper, but she knew better. She thought of the last mission, the faces she'd seen, the ones she couldn't save. Her hand trembled slightly as she folded the paper. She didn't want to go back out there. Not again, not so soon. But the alternative, doing nothing, felt worse. So the next morning she packed. Not because she wanted another fight. Because she couldn't stand the thought of others being out there without help. The convoy moved out at dawn, dust curling behind the armored trucks. She rode in the back with the medics, the same calm expression masking the storm inside. They passed ruined towns, old battlefields, villages where children still flinched at the sound of engines. She handed out food, water, medicine, simple things, but in those small acts she found a strange kind of peace. One child stared at her wide-eyed. "You're a soldier?" he asked softly. She smiled faintly, something like that. He grinned back, tooth missing, and for the first time in weeks she laughed. It felt strange in her chest, but real. That night, while the convoy rested, she sat by the campfire with Sergeant Vega, one of the medics. He tossed a stone into the fire and asked quietly, "You ever think about leaving, just getting away from all this?" She looked at the flames, thinking. "Every day," she said, "but I think if I did, I'd still hear it. The noise, the silence after. It doesn't go away when you run. It only fades when you face it." Vega nodded slowly. "That's heavy." "Yeah," she said softly, smiling. "So's life." Later that night, she heard the sound again, the one that didn't belong. A low crack, muffled, distant. Her body reacted before her mind could. She was on her feet, rifle raised, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. "Everyone down," she whispered. Another shot rang out, closer this time. The convoy erupted into chaos. Soldiers hit the dirt, scanning for muzzle flashes. She spotted movement along the ridge too, maybe 3 figures, scouts, testing the perimeter. Her pulse slowed, her breathing steadied. She aimed, controlled, quiet, and fired. 2 lights blinked out in the distance. Then silence again. The team regrouped, shaken but alive. Vega clapped her on the shoulder. "You saved us again." She looked down at the ground. "No," she said quietly, "just did what had to be done." The others didn't press. They'd seen enough to understand. And as the convoy rolled out the next morning, the sun rising over the endless sand, she realized something had changed inside her again. It wasn't about guilt anymore. It wasn't even about redemption. It was about purpose. The kind that doesn't need orders. The kind that survives everything else. When they reached the drop point, Hale was waiting. He saluted her, formal, sharp. "Job well done, Monroe." She nodded, "Thank you, sir." He hesitated, then said, "The men, they talk about you. Say you're quiet, but when things get bad, you move first." She smirked faintly. "I used to be quiet because no one listened. Now I'm quiet because they do." Hale smiled just once. That's leadership. You ever think about taking command? She shook her head. Command isn't about being in front. It's about never walking away. That night, alone again by the fire, she looked at the stars and whispered, almost to herself, I was just a cook. Then she let out a long, steady breath. But I guess even cooks can learn how to fight when it matters. The flames flickered, the wind rose, and the camera of imagination would pull back, her silhouette small but steady against the vast desert. Because courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just keeps showing up. And when the world breaks, it's the quiet ones who hold it together. Why was the convoy so quiet that morning? No chatter, no music from the radio, no laughter echoing between the trucks, just the sound of engines and the weight of unspoken tension. Something had changed overnight. Everyone felt it. Even she did. The map said the route was clear, but the world had a way of ignoring maps. The silence of the desert wasn't peace, it was waiting. She sat in the back seat of the lead truck, eyes scanning the dunes. Her rifle rested between her knees, finger tracing the rough metal of the trigger guard. Sergeant Vega sat beside her, chewing gum to keep calm. Feels off, he muttered. Yeah, she said softly, it does. And then, as if the desert had been listening, the explosion hit. The truck in front vanished in a cloud of fire and sand. The shockwave slammed into them, flipping crates, shattering glass. She hit the floor hard, ears ringing, breath gone. Ambush, someone shouted. Gunfire ripped through the smoke. Bullets tore into metal, ricocheting off the armor. The convoy erupted, soldiers scrambling for cover, medics dragging the wounded behind wrecks. She crawled out the side hatch, sand burning her palms, and saw them. Enemy silhouettes 8, maybe 9, closing fast from the ridge. Her body moved on instinct. Rifle up, sight steady, 1 shot, 2 shots. The first man dropped. The second staggered back, shouting orders in a language she didn't understand. The others returned fire. Rounds snapped past her ears. She dove behind the wheel well of the burning truck. Vega slid in beside her, face pale, eyes wide. You good? He shouted. She nodded, reloading. Where? The lieutenant. Down, took a hit. Then we hold here, she said. Vega blinked at her, we. But she was already moving. The air burned, the sand danced with tracers. Every second stretched thin, fragile. She fired again, slow and deliberate. One by one the attackers fell, but more were coming, too many. A bullet grazed her helmet, jolting her sideways. Pain exploded behind her eyes. She ducked, panting, blood trickling from her temple. She wiped it with the back of her glove, forced herself to focus. Her hands were trembling. Her heart was a hammer in her chest, but her breathing stayed steady. Because she remembered something her old commander once said before he died. Calm isn't the absence of fear, it's the refusal to let it win. When the ammo started running low, she crawled toward the overturned supply truck. Vega followed, dragging another wounded soldier. Inside, crates had spilled everywhere, ammo, rations, medical packs. She broke one open, tossed mags toward Vega, and grabbed a smoke grenade. On my mark, she said, we move right. Through open ground. She gave him a half smile. You wanted excitement. She pulled the pin. White smoke burst across the dunes, swallowing them whole. They ran. Gunfire cut through the fog. She felt the heat of bullets as they ripped through the air inches from her back. But they made it, rolled behind a ridge, gasping for breath. She looked up. The enemy was regrouping. They had a vehicle now, mounted gun. She whispered, of course they do. Vega cursed softly. We can't hold this, we'll get shredded. She scanned the terrain. Then her eyes caught something, a line of oiled drums near the old construction site, maybe 30 meters away. Maybe we can. She handed Vega her rifle. "Cover me." He grabbed her arm. "You'll never make it." She looked him dead in the eyes. "Then don't watch." And before he could stop her, she ran. Bullets chased her, kicking up sand around her boots. She dove behind the barrels, heart hammering, hands shaking. Her lighter, a small silver one she always carried, was slick with sweat. She flicked it once, twice, it wouldn't light. The enemy vehicle was rolling closer, turret swinging toward the ridge. She stared at the lighter, whispered through gritted teeth, "Come on." Click. Flame. She kicked the barrel hard. The fire caught. Oil poured, ignited, and the world turned white. The explosion tore through the valley, flipping the enemy vehicle like a toy. The heat slammed into her, knocking her backward into the sand. When she opened her eyes, everything was silent again. Her ears rang, her chest ached. Vega was shouting her name, running toward her through the smoke. "I'm fine," she rasped. "I'm fine." He knelt beside her, eyes wide. "You're insane, you know that." She managed a weak grin. "Yeah, but effective." He laughed, shaking his head. "They should have made you an officer." "God forbid," she muttered. Hours later, the backup finally arrived. Drones circled overhead, scanning the wreckage. The wounded were loaded onto stretchers. Hale stepped off the lead transport, surveying the destruction. His eyes fell on her, covered in soot, hair matted, uniform torn. What the hell happened here? She looked around at the burning horizon, the men alive because of it, and said quietly, "We adapted." He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll make sure command knows." She shook her head. "They don't need to." That night, long after the fires died, she sat alone again under the stars. The air smelled faintly of oil and dust. She opened her hand and stared at the lighter, blackened now, the flame symbol on its side almost gone. She thought about how far she'd come, from the mess hall, from invisibility. Now people looked at her differently. They saw strength, leadership, but she still didn't feel like a hero. Because she knew what heroism really cost. She whispered to the desert, "They'll forget my name in a year." The wind carried her voice away. Then she smiled faintly. "That's fine, I didn't do it to be remembered." The camera of imagination would fade out here, the sound of wind mixing with a low, reflective score. And the narrator's voice, soft but certain, would say, "Sometimes courage isn't found in victory. It's found in what remains after. When you've given everything and still choose to stand back up. Because true strength isn't loud. It's the quiet fire that refuses to die." Why did she feel the weight of the desert more that morning than any other? It wasn't the sun. It wasn't the sand. It was the memory of every step she'd taken to get here, the smoke, the blood, the ones she couldn't save. She stood at the edge of the canyon, rifle slung, boots digging into grit. The wind whispered through the rocks, carrying a hint of something she couldn't name, fear, hope, warning. This was it, the final stretch. Harris was out there somewhere and she would find him, or she would die trying. The canyon walls closed in, shadows stretching long and deep. Every rock, every dune seemed to watch her. She knew he had to be nearby, the signals, the AI's pulse, the interference on comms. Her heart pounded, not with fear but with recognition. She had been here before in a different life. A life when she thought the world made sense. A life when she was invisible in the kitchen, invisible to everyone who mattered. But now she wasn't invisible anymore. A flicker of movement caught her eye just ahead. She froze. Her hand rested lightly on the rifle. "Harris," she whispered under her breath. The figure turned. His eyes, same sharp intelligence, same calm, but older, wiser, scarred. "You made it," he said softly. "You've been running a long time," she replied. "I had to," he said. "They wanted Vera back, but it's not safe in their hands, not anymore." Her stomach twisted. All those lives, the base, the ambush, was that you trying to save them? He nodded. I tried, I failed some, but not all, and you, his eyes softened. You did what I never imagined. You stayed when you didn't have to. The canyon was quiet, almost peaceful, but she could feel it, tension like a drawn wire. They both knew the storm wasn't over. Then why fight them? She asked. Why not disappear like you did before? Harris sighed. Because someone has to stop the people who believe information is a weapon, not a tool. Someone has to protect the truth, even if it costs everything. She lowered her rifle slightly. Then maybe it's not just about survival anymore. Maybe it's about justice. He gave a faint nod, or redemption. For hours they moved through the canyon, avoiding sensors, outsmarting patrols. Every step brought her closer to understanding him and herself. They reached a ridge overlooking the enemy's stronghold. Vera's core glowed faintly in the dark, small, almost unassuming, yet unimaginably powerful. Once we disable this, Harris said, we can finally end it, but it's risky. One wrong move. She stepped forward. I've survived worse. He studied her. You've grown since the kitchen. She smirked faintly. The desert teaches fast. The infiltration was silent. Shadows merged with shadows. Every sound had meaning. Every breath was calculated. They reached the core. Harris worked the panel, fingers flying over holographic keys. She kept watch, rifle raised, senses sharp. And then they were discovered. Alarm blared. Red lights painted the walls. Enemy soldiers poured into the room. Without thinking, she fired, controlled, precise, one after another until the last man fell. Harris finished the sequence. The core powered down, its glow fading. She exhaled, trembling. It's done. He looked at her. Not yet. She frowned. What do you mean? Someone has to live to tell them the truth, to show them what happens when you abuse power. That's why you survive, Alina. She stared at him, the weight of everything settling in, the lives, the missions, the choices. Then she realized survival wasn't about her anymore. It was about what she could do with it. They emerged into the dawn, walking through the desert, silent, exhausted, wounded, but alive. When the extraction chopper appeared, Harris paused. I have to disappear again. You can't know what comes next. She nodded. I understand. He hesitated, then said quietly, thank you for everything. She gave a faint smile. Don't thank me, just don't forget what's right. And before she could speak again, he was gone into the horizon, swallowed by sand and sun. The chopper lifted her into the sky. The base below looked small, fragile, safe for now. She touched the dog tag in her pocket, felt the weight of it. Every life she'd saved, every lesson she'd learned, every quiet act of courage, it all led here. She whispered to herself, sometimes the ones nobody notices are the ones who make all the difference. And as the wind rushed past, carrying dust and light, she realized she had finally come full circle. From the kitchen to the battlefield. From invisibility to strength. From doubt to clarity. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves. Sometimes courage doesn't roar, it simply stands. And Alina Morales, cook, soldier, survivor, stood taller than ever before. Moral reflection. The quietest heroes often bear the loudest truths. Strength isn't always shown in victories or medals. It is proven in persistence, in moral courage, in standing when the world expects you to fall. Sometimes survival is not enough. True heroism is when you rise, again and again, to protect what matters most.